Jardines de la Reina is an archipelago of islands off the south central coast of Cuba. It means Gardens of the Queen in Spanish. And there's another famous archipelago off the north coast of Cuba named Jardines del Rey, meaning Gardens of the King. They were both named by Columbus after the King and Queen of Spain in the late 1400s during his visit to the Americas. Gardens of the Queen is really considered one of the most pristine marine habitats on the planet, and there's some reasons why. Part of the reason is its isolation. It's 50 to 60 miles off the coastline, which makes it difficult to exploit and to get to. More importantly, however, is that the Cuban government has protected much of its coastline and put that coastline into marine reserves and national parks. And that happened with Gardens of the Queen in the mid-1990s. So it's got this incredible protection, and it means that there's no commercial fishing of any sort that's done there. There's only one outfitter as well that's allowed to bring tourists to the archipelago, and those tourists typically make up one of three categories. They're eco-tourists in some cases, they're divers because it's considered to be one of the best dive destinations on the planet, and they're anglers, and those anglers are only fly fisher men and women because fly fishing is the only method of operation that's allowed here. The archipelago itself is over 100 miles long, and it's made up of about 600 individual islands, most of which are mangroves. And the total protected area is over 800 square miles, so it's quite vast. If you want to learn a little bit more about how special the environment is, I'd really recommend that you sit down at the computer and Google up Anderson Cooper in 60 Minutes in Cuba. And you'll see an episode that 60 Minutes did several years ago where they sent out Anderson Cooper there. He lived on one of the boats that's used today even for anglers and divers. And he spent a lot of time in the company of marine biologists, both from within Cuba and from outside of Cuba. And he did a lot of diving as well. And what he learned from those marine biologists is that this small archipelago is a representative of what life used to be like under the water in our tropical oceans. And they say that there are two things that they look for when they travel the world to see a healthy marine environment. The first is an abundance of apex predators, which Gardens of the Queen has. It means lots of sharks of different species, and other predatory fish like Goliath grouper, which they have here. The second thing that they look for is healthy coral. And we've all heard the reports from the news about coral reefs dying and bleaching. And these same marine biologists say that this is not something that they see in abundance in Gardens of the Queen. So simply it's regarded as one of the most preserved and pristine marine habitats left on the planet. So the great thing about Gardens of the Queen being isolated is that it's kept it from being overexploited. The bad news is it's a little bit harder to get to, as you can imagine. So there are two quite popular routes to get there. One is to fly into the town of Camagüey. Now, Camagüey is only about an hour and a half or 2 hours from the port of Jucaro, and Jucaro is where you have to get to in order to board the boat to go out to the archipelago. The other popular path is coming through Havana, which is completely understandable because there are a lot of daily flights to Havana, and it's an interesting city, and even more importantly, if it's your first time to Cuba, it's kind of a place you have to go. I really do recommend it. Now that means, however, that your drive to Jucaro is about 5.5 or 6 hours, so it's significantly longer. Now, I particularly like the drive. I think it gives you a chance to look at life in rural Cuba, which is, of course, much different than what you would have seen in Havana. Once at Jucaro, you'll be greeted and then directed towards the boat that you will be living on for the week. And then you bring all your stuff aboard and you start steaming towards the archipelago. That trip takes anywhere from 3 to 5 hours, depending upon the boat you're on, how fast it goes, and the sea conditions. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the diversity of boats out here. So there are no land-based operations at all. So it's all live-aboard boats. And the outfitter has a range of them, and they do change from year to year. Some come out of service and some new ones come in. But I want to give you some examples of what's out there. The Avalon 2 is a great example of one of the premium boats. Now, this boat is over 100 feet long. It's extremely comfortable. It houses groups of up to about 12 anglers very comfortably. It's got 3 decks, a hot tub, water slide, etc. So it's quite plush, and as such, it's a little bit more expensive. At the other end of the spectrum are boats like Parola. Now, Parola is about 65 feet long. It doesn't have a water slide or a hot tub, but again, it's very comfortable, and part of the reason for that is that instead of having groups of 12, it maxes out at angling groups of 6. So you can understand it's a little bit proportional, as are the prices. Another boat that you should know about is Tortuga. Tortuga is the original accommodation in Gardens of the Queen. It's a houseboat really, or a hotel built upon a barge, and it's very comfortable. It's been refurbished and it's quite spacious, and it's quite popular with both divers and anglers alike. You can see from the satellite image that it's moored in between a bunch of mangroves in a very protected area, and it stays there. And this is the head of operations for the outfitter in the archipelago. It's where they store skiffs and do repairs on skiffs and keep fuel, etc. And you'll see it one way or another. If you're going to stay on Tortuga, you're transported out there and then you ultimately end up on the boat. And if you're staying on one of the other boats, your first night you will typically moor near Tortuga. And the reason for that is your guides will have come out with you. They've had the day off, and then they'll transport out with you, and they need a little bit of time to get their skiff ready and all provisioned, etc. So you spend that night there. The next morning, your guides will come out in skiffs and meet you, and you'll take off to go fishing. Now, how this works is that you will go in one direction all day long. So, for example, if you leave in your skiff and go east, you'll continue going east all day long, fishing along the way. At the end of the day, you'll turn around and go back a little ways, and you'll find miraculously that your liveaboard boat is there and already waiting for you, because of course they've steamed behind you all day long to get out there, and they set their moorage, and that's where they remain for the rest of the week. Now, a little bit more about the boats and how they're positioned is that the outfitter makes sure that they do spread these boats apart. The archipelago, again, is about 100 miles apart. So if they were really full, maxed out, they would have 3 liveaboard boats out there with anglers, but they would put one at the east end, one at the west, and Tortuga in the middle, and it means that there's a lot of miles in between each one of those boats. More importantly, the outfitter has also created very definite geographic areas for each one of those parts of the archipelago. And the guides and the captains know about these. So if, for example, you were fishing that eastern quadrant, your guides would all know that they can't go further west than a certain point, because if they do, they would then be encroaching on the next group's area. So this is one of the best things about fishing in Cuba, and in fact all the different areas in Cuba, and that is that you never compete with anybody else for your fishing area. Think about that compared to Yellowstone Park or Alaska or Ascension Bay in Mexico for that matter. It's quite spectacular. Lastly, in talking about the boats, as I mentioned, there's no land-based operation out here. We do get customers that express some reservation about being, as they say, trapped on a boat for a week. For some people, they can't do it, right? And we'll talk to them about land-based operations where the accommodations are comfortable and the fishing is excellent as well. But for everyone else, we do really want to talk to them about how truly comfortable all of the boats are in their own ways. And part of that is due to the outfitter just working really hard to make sure that all of the boats are well provisioned. But more importantly, they've done a really good job of having incredible staffs that understand their mission. The staff is made up uniquely of Cuban nationals. Your fishing guides are Cuban, the captain is, the engineer, your cook, your deckhands, and the hostesses that work aboard the boats. And I think one of the great things about the week that you spend out here is that you get to know all of those people. And life in Cuba is different, and you will learn a lot about these people, and you'll end up, after the course of a week, understanding a lot more about what life in Cuba is like, and it's very interesting. Lastly, I would just talk real briefly about the food. The food in Cuba in general is not great. They have a tough time getting great provisions, and as such, the food can be a little bit mundane. It's not the case out here on the boats. The outfitter has worked incredibly hard to make sure that they have everything that they need and that you need. It means all the kinds of drinks you can imagine, all the sodas, water, wine, and other alcohols. But it means that you've got fresh fruit and fresh vegetables and fresh squeezed fruit juice, pork dishes, chicken dishes, and of course lots of fresh seafood as well, from fish to lobster to shrimp. And it really is amazing how hard these people work to give you great food. You'll see fresh pasta sometimes that's having been prepared all day long when you're out fishing, and it'll be drying in the kitchen when you get back. So I just can't say enough about how hard the outfitter and the workers themselves work to make sure that you're comfortable during your week on the boat. Okay, I think we can finally talk about the fishing. Now, the fishing here is of course very good, and that's because of what we talked about earlier. This is a really protected area and quite pristine and healthy. And besides the fact that there are lots of fish there, what I really love about it is the diversity of the habitats that you see and that you fish in. So you can imagine in the course of a week, you would fish coral flats and you fish soft flats, you can fish back channels and mangroves, and you fish the open ocean sometimes even. So it's very diverse. The types of fish there are diverse as well, so let's talk about them. Of course, there are bonefish there, and there are bonefish that are throughout the whole 100 miles of the archipelago, and they're very prolific. Now, many of those fish are between 3 and 5 pounds. So there are bigger fish in other places in Cuba and the Bahamas, etc. There's certainly fish beyond 5 pounds here, but a majority of them are in that category. What's great is that you do get to see them again in a lot of diverse kinds of habitats, and you, as an angler, get to change up how you do it. So you could wade fish for them sometimes, while other times you'll be fishing out of the boat. When it comes to permit, Gardens of the Queen is really considered one of the premier destinations on the planet, really, and certainly in all of Cuba. Now, if you're coming here as a really permit-crazed angler and permit were really your primary fish, we'd have a talk beforehand about other places too. You talk about Zapata, Cayo Largo, and Cayo Cruz, but Gardens of the Queen would be in this mix because it's a great permit destination. And like the bone fishing, you'll find permit in a diversity of habitats. So you may see one lone big fish tailing on a soft flat, or a group of fish finning slowly over a coral flat, or a really big group of permit in a back bay or something like that. But the permit fishing can be quite spectacular. Now, the tarpon fishing is very special in Gardens of the Queen. Think about the habitat. We mentioned early on that the archipelago is 100 miles long and made up of really hundreds and hundreds of mangrove islands, and tarpon love mangroves. They grow up in the mangroves and they stay in and around the mangroves until they get to be about 30 pounds or so when they reach sexual maturity and they join the migration. And what that means is that any month of the year your guides can take you into that mangrove habitat and find these resident tarpon, and they're very willing fish and really a blast. Now, the tarpon fishing changes in early spring, and it changes throughout the course of the early summer as well. But it starts in the springtime, and it changes because there's an influx of migratory fish. So there's a lot more tarpon that show up. Now, these fish are generally between 30 and 70 pounds, so they're not like the migratory fish that you might see in the Florida Keys that are 120 or 150 pounds. But if you ask me, that's great. They're the perfect tarpon. Because what it means is that a 50-pound fish cruising down the flats, if you put a fly in front of that fish, it'll eat it. And then it does everything else that a big tarpon does. It jumps and it runs and it pulls hard, but you can land that fish in 15 or 20 minutes. And I like that because it means you can get back to catching more tarpon, or you can go find a permit or a bonefish flat or something like that. Also, this time of year means that all of the tarpon fishing is sight fishing, really. So one of the common things that you'll see in Jardines de la Reina in the springtime and summer is you'll see fish cruising down a beach over sand, and they'll be coming along in groups of 5 to 15 or 5 to 20 fish in a group. So it's completely visual, and again, if you put a fly in front of those fish, one of them is going to eat it. It's incredible. One other thing about what may happen to you if you're out here during tarpon season is that you may get a knock on your door early in the morning where a guide will poke his head in and say, "Senor, it's flat, calm, there's no wind." It can be great tarpon fishing, so I'd encourage you to try this at least once. And so you'll get up really early in the morning, you'll jump in a skiff, it'll be dead black, and it'll be crazy because you're going along in the skiff and you can't see anything. So it's sort of otherworldly, but your guides know where they're going. And it may be that you even anchor in a channel and cast and strip and fight tarpon in a channel in the complete darkness, because tarpon love the channels at nighttime. But you can imagine how special this experience is, that you can be on a big back bay with oily, glassy water and tarpon rolling and the sun coming up behind them. So it can really be a special experience. Lastly, when it comes to the fish, you can imagine with this habitat being so healthy that all the other species of fish live there as well, and they do. So there are jacks and snapper and barracuda and grouper, etc. that are there. So I'd encourage you to not forget about those fish, because they can be really fun. So remind your guide that you like them. Remind your guide that if you're going from one flat to another, that if there's a chance to fish a little channel or a little blue hole, to do it. And it can be really quick. You can put a popper or a clauser minnow on and make some casts through there. There's nothing, but it can be gangbusters as well with the fish on every cast. And you could really surprise yourself with a big jack or a big cubera snapper or something like that. Your last day of fishing will be different than all the others. Let me explain why. So you've got to get back near Tortuga by a fairly decent hour. So you'll start really early, and you'll fish your way in the opposite direction as you did the first day. But the idea is that you've got to get back near Tortuga, and you've got to give your liveaboard boat time to get back there as well. So you'll all end up there in the early afternoon, and it gives the guides time to store their skiffs, put their gear all away, and join the boat so they can come back to Hookeroo with you. Once in Hookeroo, you'll spend the night in port aboard the boat. And you'll have a smaller crew, but there'll be enough people there to make sure you're comfortable. You've got drinks and dinner, and then breakfast the next morning. And after breakfast, you generally head directly back to whichever city you're going to leave from. So in summary, there's a couple things that make Gardens of the Queen really special. The first is, and of course we covered a lot, and that is that it's just this incredibly healthy, protected, pristine marine environment, one of the few really intact marine environments left on the planet. The other thing that's really important for us as anglers is that all species of flats fish that we like as fly anglers live there every month of the year. And so these two things in combination really makes Gardens of the Queen one of the best destinations in Cuba, and certainly one of the best flats destinations on the planet.